It's time for an updated Best X video. Did the OTA update knocking Professor X down to just one power have a meaningful impact on the format? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at it. Drumroll please, our most popular deck after the OTA update is Lockdown! Yep, just Professor X, Storm, follow up your secondary path with Alioth or Shang-Chi to knock out a win, or spread wide across the entire board with Doctor Doom, whichever your opponent can't handle, is one of the most popular and top performing decks in the metagame still. One noteworthy call out in the lockout list for this week is that it's leveraging Zabu, since it's playing Shang-Chi as well as Jessica Jones as additional 4 energy plays. This lets you proactively play cards like Miss Marvel, Jones, and Iron Lad in games where you don't have Storm to start shutting down a lane on turn 3. While the Zabu variation of Lockdown here is the top performing build in this archetype category, it is worth noting that there's a lot of variation of people trying different things while locking people out of the game. Most notably, the most popular Lockdown build that has a bit worse stats is actually one featuring Ronan the Accuser. I expect because the metrics on this one are worse than a lot of the other variations, it'll fall in popularity once Ronan is no longer a shiny new toy that was recently buffed, but it's worth noting that this build playing Master Mold and Baron Mordor most likely means you're about to get Stormed and then Alioth if you run into it out in the wild. Our second most popular archetype is back to being Loki with this OT update. Werewolf by Night was nerfed, but it's still contained in the most played Loki variation. Notable callouts here are that Zabu is being included now since Werewolf is a 4 energy card along with Loki, and tech cards like Shang-Chi. The rest of this core is very similar to bounce Loki decks we've seen in previous seasons, with nothing too novel going on here. I know Loki's been a popular deck for a little while now, and people are kind of sick of playing against it to a degree, but it's worth noting that this most popular build of Loki has a pretty middling right around 50% win rate, and actually floating right around 0 average cubes gained per game in a thousands of match sample size. Hey, at least Loki has one thing going for it. It's not a lockout deck that stops you from playing the game, or is it? Because in some fresh new hell that we've been transported to, while the Werewolf Loki deck is now struggling after Werewolf has been adjusted, this Loki lockout deck is actually one of the top performing Loki variations that has hundreds of games logged with it, top ending Miss Marvel, Professor X, Alioth, and Jeff the Baby Landshark. I assume to give it counterplay against opposing lockout decks, but also just so it can be a lockout deck itself. Our third most popular deck really hammers home the message that Professor X is down, but he's certainly not out, as this Blob Thanos lockout deck featuring Professor X and Alioth is still alive and kicking, not only popular, but actually having one of the highest average cube gains of all the decks on the post-Infinite Marvel Snap ladder. The real strength of this Thanos deck, in my opinion, is the kind of catch-22 situations it puts your opponents into on key turns of the game. You accelerate with a Time Stone or a Psylocke on turn 3. That turn 4 could bring Professor X locking down a lane, meaning your opponent kind of needs to play to every path to make sure that doesn't happen. Or you could just slam down this Vision, which punishes for doing them exactly that, since he's 8 points of power that plays for every lane simultaneously. Similarly, on the final turn of the game, your opponent is generally in a damned if they do, damned if they don't situation when it comes to playing for priority. If they throw priority so they can try and Shang-Chi your Blob or play around your copy of Shang-Chi, you just play out an Alioth and blow away whatever their final play was. And the inverse is true. If they play for priority so they can beat your Alioth, they're going to get chopped down to size by your Shang-Chi, or your Blob's just going to be massive and they're not going to be able to contend it. While Professor X is still everywhere after the OT update, our fourth most popular deck this week shows that maybe things are at least looking up a little bit, since Destroy is back on the map, both with a reasonable play rate and having good win rate and average cube gains. If you enjoy this classic Marvel Snap archetype, it looks like it is a reasonable pick again per the metrics. Moving along from our most popular to top performing archetypes with smaller metagame percentages, we have Darkhawk clocking in at number 1. It's noteworthy that Black Widow's change from a 2/1 to a 3/3 means she still has an inclusion in this deck, and the most noteworthy tech inclusion in this archetype is Leech as a 5 energy card, giving this deck a way to kind of beat that Thanos false choice that I was talking about, where you just clear the text off their Blob and Alioth and Shang-Chi, so you can just play your cards out on the final turn of the game instead of playing this shell guessing game. My one piece of advice if you're going to pick this deck up and play it with Leech is just be aware if your opponent is not playing one of those Alioth Blob decks, that playing Leech is often not going to be a great turn 5 play because it costs you a lot of board presence. I can't tell you the number of times I've played against this deck with varying other decks that don't really care about Leech, and my opponent leeches me on 5, using up a ton of resources for basically no power, and they can't actually win the game on the final turn. Our next top performer this week is one we've been talking about for a little bit, but just never really picks up in popularity despite having consistently some of the best metrics in Marvel Snap, and that is Galactus Lockdown. This Lockdown deck has a very strong two-pronged plan of attack. Sometimes you're just a traditional Lockdown deck using Professor X to lock up one lane backed up by things like Miss Marvel, and then you win your second path with either Shang-Chi or Alioth, depending on if you have priority or not, or by slamming down a massive Orca who represents up to 21 points of stats when supported by Miss Marvel. This deck list also just does Galactus stuff sometimes though, where you play Electro on turn 3, you play Hobgoblin on turn 4, you Galactus away to just that path on turn 5, and then you clear out whatever their final play was going to be with the big purple fart cloud on turn 6. Our second top performing deck this week is a Ramp Blob variation with a relatively straightforward game plan. We utilize Electro or Wave to play Blob on turn 5, and then we utilize either Living Tribunals to split his massive stat line across all 3 lanes, or Taskmaster to copy it directly into a second one. Noteworthy tech inclusion in this deck is Armor. That's the place you're going to want to try and hide your big blob behind so you can duck commonly played tech card Shang-Chi. Moving from our top performing category to decks that have high potential, it's always worth noting for people that haven't watched my videos before, the difference between these two groups is that while the high potential deck lists have really strong stats on the untapped tracker, they also have pretty statistically insignificant sample sizes, so these could very well be gems in the rough that are going to be phenomenal as that sample gets bigger. They could also mellow out in terms of metrics a little bit as their sample sizes improve. Our first high potential deck list this week is one that attacks on multiple axes to always leave your opponent guessing exactly which strategy you're going to be implementing. We have Black Knight as well as Ghost Rider to let Blade and Lady Sif put the Infinite into play for a discounted price, as well as get that Ebony Blade an absolutely massive stat line. This deck list is also leveraging Zabu to not only make Ghost Rider and the Blade cheaper, but also let us leverage powerful tech cards Shang-Chi and Enchantress so we can interact with other decks that might try to go over the top of us with things like Blob or Living Tribunal. Finally, because Infinite plays well with She-Hulk and having an extra turn with Magic, this deck is also playing Sunspot along with Limbo, so we can pass on turn 6 to slam both She-Hulk and Infinite in different lanes on the 7th and final turn of the game. If you want to see this deck in action, it'll actually be the deck highlight here on this channel tomorrow morning. Be sure to check back in. You won't want to miss that. Our second high potential deck list is one that I featured on this channel before, but it's putting up some really powerful metrics and smaller sample sizes so far this season. It is this Moon Girl Darkhawk She-Hulk variation. This deck list allows you to play a Darkhawk deck with those powerful disruptive elements, but also not just be caught up creek without a paddle in the matchups where your opponent draws and plays Blob, shrinking your Hawks to 0. Thanks to She-Hulk as well as Miss Marvel providing alternative massive stat lines, this deck list has flexible game plans that give you counterplay into everything. The really strength of this build as opposed to other traditional Darkhawk builds is just the unpredictability of what your output range is going to be on the last turn of the game, especially in games involving Quinjet as well as Zabu. Your opponent's often going to be left guessing. Are you going to be deploying Miss Marvel and multiple Darkhawks? Are there She-Hulk slamming down? Are they going to get caught by your copy of Armor, protecting your large cards from being blown away? There's lots of powerful plays in this deck in those important final moments of the game. To close out with a couple of personal pocket picks of mine, we're going to kick things off with a blast from the past, a Kraven Kitty Movers deck. I picked this one back up because I just wanted to play with a number of cards that I hadn't touched in a little bit, and I was pleasantly surprised at the strength that I felt like it had in the metagame. Angela, as well as Craven, and our cheat movement cards, Nightcrawler, Jeff, and Silk, let us get a lot of stats on the board early that makes it difficult for people to lock us out of the game with Professor X, even on turn 4. The top end of this deck is also incredibly disruptive. Arrow and Magneto are both cards I've been really impressed with in this metagame, making it so it's difficult for the opponent to predict where their stats are going to be in those final big important turns of the game. If you're someone who absolutely despises lockdown decks like myself and you want to shove them into a trash can as frequently as possible, this Stature Zabu deck is my #1 recommendation for doing that. We have explicit direct counterplay to locations being locked out thanks to cards like Jeff the Baby Landshark, Miss Marvel, and Doctor Doom, but we also get to proactively attack these lockout cards thanks to Silver Samurai, often targeting low power cards like Professor X and Alioth while they're still in our opponent's hand. This deck's greatest strength in this metagame past all of that, though, is the fact that while it gets to play its own copy of Shang-Chi being a Zabu deck, while simultaneously not being weak to opposing Shang-Chi's, since we're playing out a lot of cards that have stat lines in the 5 to 8 range that Shang-Chi just can't interact with. My final pocket pick this week is the Moon Girl deck I've been enjoying the most, and that is this She-Hulk Board Swarm Tempo Control deck. The specific package I want to call out in this deck that I think is generically very good right now is the combination of Echo, Goose, and Cosmo. These 3 cards allow us to proactively dictate where the opponent is allowed to play cards like Professor X and Blob, meaning we can manipulate the game in such a way that we can play for the paths where they are least likely or completely unable to deploy those cards to, letting us kind of pick and choose which battles we're going to be fighting. It's worth noting that while I'm playing Martyr in this deck, and I think she's a good inclusion since we consistently fill up the board, I would not recommend spending your hard-earned collector tokens on her. If you're missing Martyr, you could definitely replace her with something like Lizard or Silk or another card that has a big power with a low energy cost. To close out with a couple of thoughts on the metagame that are interesting things that I noticed while poring over all of the data and playing my own games, the first thing that stands out is that there are 2 archetypes that have been frequently found in these videos that are absent this week because their metrics are just absolutely abysmal. Specifically, Shuri as well as Apocalypse Discard are decks that have completely miserable win rates and average cubes. To my best educated speculation on to why that is, I would wager it's because Blob has essentially power crept these decks that just make big numbers out of the format. Why spend 2 cards and build your entire deck around setting up Shuri Red Skull when you can just play a Blob and be much larger than 28? Similarly, the discard decks are strong synergy decks that don't have room to play interactive cards like Shang-Chi or Shadow King, meaning in the past they've kept up simply by making reasonable numbers in all their paths across the board. But again, the way Blob just gets so big for just 6 energy with almost no deck building consideration means that these decks just can't keep up anymore. All in all, while Professor X definitely didn't dip in play rate significantly like I was hoping with his 2-point reduction, I think there's more good than bad in this format. The Jeff's picks as well as high potential decks really showcase some of the ways you can build to attack the popular decks in this format and still see success. I'm coming off of a week where I streamed over 65 hours of Marvel Snap with all the insanity that Drops brings on the Twitch side, and I honestly enjoyed a significant portion of it. I think those little tempo decks that play cards like Goose, Echo, and Cosmo can really be built in a variety of different ways, so you can kind of pick and choose which tech and payoff cards you want to play around that proactive disruptive suite to make yourself competitive in this format. As always, if you learned anything or you enjoyed my musings on this topic, be sure to snap that like button to help this video reach more people. Also, as a shout out, while I won't be live streaming this week because I'm spending time with the family for the end of the year while the kiddos are off of school, you will find edited content on this channel every single day for the rest of this week. And my secondary YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jeff Hoagland, is going to have a whole bunch of fantastic deck highlights that are a bit longer than what you find on this channel, that are straight cuts from all of that live streaming I did, so you can find the best of the best without having to dig through those 13-hour archive videos. As always, thanks for watching all the way to the end, and hopefully we'll see you back again tomorrow for some sweet decks here on the channel.